Thanks very much. This is the 27th meeting of the New Right, and we've waited quite a long time to discuss one of the most important thinkers of the radical right and of a traditional perspective upon mankind and reality, and that is Baron Julius Evola. Now, Evola is, in some respects, to the right of everybody that we've ever considered in nearly any of these talks, and not in a sort of unprofound or sententious manner. Julius Evola was somebody who rejected purposefully and metaphysically the modern world. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that at the beginning of the last century, Baron Evola, who's a Sicilian baron, decided that there were about 4 alternatives in relation to modern life for those of a heroic spirit. One was suicide and to make off with oneself by opening one's veins in the warm bath like Sicilian mafiosi and Italian cardinals and Sicilian sort of brigands and ancient Romans. Another was to become a Nietzschean, which for many people in tradition is a modern version of some, but by no means all, of their ideas, and is a way of riding the tiger of modernity and dealing with that which exists around us now. Later, people like Evola and other perennial traditionalists, as we may well call them, became increasingly critical of Nietzsche and regard him as a sort of decadent modern and an active nihilist who has a bit of spirit and vigour but doesn't really have the real position. I make things quite clear. I would be regarded by most people as a Nietzschean, and philosophically that's the motivation I've always had since my beginning. That's why parties don't really mean that much to me, because ideas are eternal and ideas and values come back, but movements and the ways and forms that they take and the expressions that they have come and go. Now, moving from the Nietzschean perspective, which of course relates to the great German thinker at the end of the 19th century and his active and quasi-existential and volitional view of man, is the idea of foundational religiosity or primary religious and spiritual purpose. In high philosophy, there are views which dominate everyone around us, and modern media, and everyone who goes to a tertiary educational college, such as a university in a Western world. These are modern ideas which are materialistic and anti-spiritual and aspiritual and anti-religious or antagonistic to prior religious belief, so much so that it's taken as a given that those are the views that one holds. All of the views that have convulsed the Western intelligentsia since the Second European Civil War, which ended in 1945, ideas like existentialism and behaviourism and structuralism and so on, are all atheistic and material views. They've been discussed in other meetings. If one goes back slightly, one has various currents of opinion, such as Marxism and Freudianism and behaviourism, beginning in the late 19th century and convulsing much of the 20th century. But these are views that an advanced Evolian type perspective rejects. These views are anti-metaphysical and often counter the idea that metaphysics doesn't exist, that it's the school returning of the late medieval period, what was called the medieval schoolmen. See, in some of his books, Evola talks about Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, of course, who got into trouble in the early 1930s for his alleged academic sort of positioning in relation to the most controversial regime of modernity. Heidegger, in my opinion, and I've talked about Heidegger before, is a quasi-essentialist to essentialist thinker. Evola believes he's an existentialist, but that's largely by the by. These anti-metaphysical views are that which surrounds us. All liberalism, all feminism, all quasi-Marxism, all bourgeois Marxism, all cultural Marxism, the extreme left moderated a bit into the centre, high capitalist economics and the return of old liberalism against the Keynesism, which was the soft Marxism that replaced it earlier in the 20th century. All of these ideas are materialistic and atheistic and aspiritual and anti-metaphysical. You could argue that the heroic Nietzschean dilemma in relation to what's called modernity is a quasi-metaphysical and metaphysically subjectivist view, that there are values outside man and outside history that human beings commune with by virtue of the intensity with which they live their own lives. But there is a question mark over one, the supernatural, and two, whether there is anything beyond and outside man within which those values could be anchored. So the idea of an impermanence, the idea of a metaphysical realm, which most prior civilizations, indeed Evola and the traditionalists would say all prior civilizations are based on, is questioned by the Nietzschean compact. It is ultimately maybe the beginnings of a very right-wing modern view, but it is a modernist view. Take it or leave it. The sort of viewpoint that Evola moved towards, and there was a progression in his early life and spiritual career and intellectual and writing career, is towards what we might call metaphysical objectivism. This is called, in present-day language, foundationalism or fundamentalism in relation to religiosity. Fundamentalism, like the far right, are the two areas of culture that can't be assimilated in what exists out there in Parade Street. They're the two things that are outside, and that's why they can never entirely be drawn in. Now, metaphysical objectivism is the absolute belief in the supernatural, the absolute belief in other states of reality, the absolute belief in gods and goddesses, the absolute belief in one supreme power, monotheism as against polytheism, for example, the absolute belief that certain iterizations, certain forms of language and spiritual culture exist outside man. Truth, justice, the meaning of law, purposive or teleological information about how our lives should be lived. Most people in Western societies now are so dumbed down and so degraded by almost every aspect of life that nearly any philosophical speculation about life is indeterminate and almost completely meaningless. It's a channel which they never turn on. Now, the type of metaphysical objectivism that Evola postulates as being an anchor for meaning in modern life can take many different forms. One of the great problems many right-wing or refoundational or primal movements or tribal movements or nationalistic movements of whatever character have is if there's a religion somewhere behind it, as there often is for many but not all of the key people involved in such movements and struggles, what form should that be? Everyone knows that culturally, and this is true of a formulation like Grèce or the New Right in France, as soon as you begin to get people of like mind together, they will split. They will split on whether they're atheists or not, secularists or not, but they were also at a deeper cultural level split on whether they're pagan influenced or Christian. Such divisions always bedevil right-wing cultural and metapolitical groups. The way that the Evolian tradition looks at this is to engage in what's called perennialism. This is the inherent intellectual and ideological and theological idea that there are certain key truths in all of the major faiths. All of those faiths that have survived, that are recorded, that have come down to us, even their pale antecedents, even those dissident, deviant, and would-be heretical elements of them that have been removed, in all of them can be seen a shard of the perspectival truth that these particular traditions could be said to manifest. Beneath this, of course, is the ethnic and racial idea that people in different groups within mankind as a body perceive reality differently, experience it differently, have different intellectual and linguistic responses to it, and form different cults, different myths, different religions, because they are physically constituted in a manner that leads to such differentiation. This can lead amongst certain perennialists to a sort of universalism at times, almost a neoliberalism occasionally, where all cultures are of value, where all are interesting, quote unquote, where all are quite slightly interchangeable. But given that danger, the advantage for a deeply religious mind of the perennial tradition is to avoid the sectarianism and negative puritanism, which is inevitably part and parcel of building up large religious structures. As always, a thinker like Evola proceeds from the individual and goes to